I was standing waist-deep in the Spanish River when I realized the thing watching me from the birch trees wasn't a bear. The arms were too long, the shoulders were wrong, and when it turned its head and looked directly at me across 60 feet of cold water, I understood something that has haunted me for every single day of the last 34 years. I had just locked eyes with something that should not exist. My name is Roy Callahan. I'm 79 years old. I was a commercial fisherman for 31 years. And this is the first time I've ever told anyone what lived along that river. I need you to understand who I was before any of this happened, because it matters. I retired in 1987 out of Sudbury, Ontario, after 3 decades working the rivers of the Canadian Shield, the Spanish, the Mississauga, the Serpent. In the spring of 1989, I leased 22 acres along a bend of the Spanish River, about 18 miles north of Española. A timber company owned it. There was a shed on the property I converted into a basic camp. Cot, wood stove, Coleman lantern. Nothing fancy, exactly what I needed. My wife, Darlene, had passed in 1986, ovarian cancer. 28 years of marriage ended in 4 months of doctors and hospitals and a quiet Tuesday morning in October when she just wasn't there anymore. I don't have words for what that does to a person. I don't think there are words. I know that by 1989, I was still trying to figure out how to exist in a world she wasn't in. The river helped. It always had. It was April 14th, 1989. I remember the exact date because I'd been listening to a transistor radio and there was a news report about the Exxon Valdez spill up in Alaska. 3 weeks gone and still burning, they said. I turned the radio off and just sat with the sound of the river instead. I'd been fishing since dawn. The Spanish River at that bend was maybe 40 feet wide, cold and dark with snowmelt, the banks crowded with white birch and trembling aspen, still coming into leaf. I'd caught 2 walleye and was working a deep pool near a log jam when I felt it. The weight of being watched. Not fear exactly, more like the feeling you get when someone steps into a room behind you before you've heard them. Every fisherman who has spent real time in deep wilderness knows this feeling. It is different from ordinary quiet. It has intention behind it. I turned slowly. On the opposite bank, something stood in the shadows of the birches. My first thought was bear. Big black bear standing upright, watching the river, but the proportions were wrong immediately. Too tall, too narrow through the hips, too long in the arms, much too long. And then it turned its head and looked directly at me, and I felt every hair on my body stand at once. The face was not a bear's face. It held my gaze for what I estimate was 20 seconds. Then it simply stepped back into the birches and was gone. No crashing, no breaking branches, just gone, the way smoke goes. I stood in that river for a long time after that, my line drifting slack, trying to find an explanation that would hold water. I couldn't find one. I thought that would be the last time I ever saw it. I was wrong, because 2 weeks later, I went back to that pool, and what I found in the mud along the bank changed everything. Tracks? I measured them with the ruler I kept in my tackle bag. 17 inches long, 6 inches wide at the ball of the foot, 5 toes, deeply pressed into the mud, indicating enormous weight. The stride between prints, where the bank allowed me to follow further, was staggering, over 5 feet between steps. I photographed everything. I went back to camp and filled 6 pages in my field notebook. And I made a decision I've kept for 34 years. I told no one. The second encounter came in June, at dusk, about 200 yards upstream from camp. I was wading back along the bank after a long evening session when I saw it again. This time it was standing in a shallow riffle, knee-deep in the current, perfectly still, watching the water the way a great blue heron watches, patient and absolute. I stopped moving. I stood on that bank without breathing. It was bigger than I'd registered the first time. 8 feet, I think, though the failing light made it difficult to be certain. Dark brown, almost black fur, damp and heavy. It knew I was there. The head turned slightly in my direction, but it didn't move, didn't startle, didn't flee. It just acknowledged my presence and returned its attention to the water. Like it had already made a decision about me. I stood on that bank for 15 minutes without moving, And then the creature reached into the current with one enormous hand and came up with a pike, not a swipe. A deliberate, almost gentle retrieval. It looked at the fish, then it looked at me, and it set the fish back in the water. Then it walked to the far bank and disappeared into the shield forest. I've turned that gesture over in my mind 10,000 times since, setting the fish back, looking at me first. I have never been able to fully explain what it meant, but I know. It meant something. That gesture was not the behavior of an animal. It was a communication. By August of 1989, I'd accepted that this creature lived along my stretch of river, or moved through it regularly. I'd found more tracks, broken branches at heights that made no sense for deer or moose, a series of markings on an old-growth white pine, about 9 feet off the ground, not claw marks. More deliberate than that, almost like notation. I started leaving things at the edge of the clearing. Not food, not at first. Small offerings of acknowledgement. A smooth stone placed deliberately on a flat boulder by the water, a bright lure left on a log. They were always gone, the next morning. Then came fall of 1990, October, early, the sugar maples turning scarlet, the brook trout running hard and silver. I woke before dawn to a sound near the shed. I took my flashlight and looked out. The creature was crouching beside my woodpile, examining a piece of split white birch, turning it in its hands, studying the grain, the way a man in a woodshop handles unfamiliar timber. When my flashlight hit it, it stood slowly, no alarm, and turned to face me. We looked at each other across 20 feet. In the pre-dawn dark, it was the first time I'd seen the face clearly. The features were neither fully ape nor fully human, but something older than both. The eyes were the most human thing about it, deep-set, dark brown, with a quality of assessment I recognized, the look of a person deciding something, not an animal's reactive stare, a considering gaze. I took a breath. "Morning," I said. Its expression shifted, not a smile, something more like registration. It set the wood down carefully, exactly where it had found it, and walked back into the forest. Left on my porch was a walleye, fresh caught, still wet. I cooked it for breakfast. And I want to tell you, it was the finest fish I'd ever eaten, which is saying something after 31 years. That was how it began. Over the following year, a pattern developed. I would find things, fish on the porch, once a bundle of wild roots, once a perfect arrangement of river stones around my fire pit that I recognized as something deliberate, something considered. In return, I left bread, dried fruit, coffee grounds. It began coming to the camp openly in the evenings, sitting at the tree line while I fished, or standing near the shed while I cleaned my catch. Never demanding, never too close, just present. I called it the River Man. The first time it ever touched me was the day I almost drowned, spring of 1991. I was working a deep run about a quarter mile from camp when I slipped on a mossy boulder and went down hard. My right leg buckled on the rock, and I knew immediately the damage was serious. The pain was white and total. I was in water up to my thighs, fighting to stay upright, trying to get my footing with one leg that wouldn't cooperate. The current was cold and steady, and I was 61 years old and alone. I grabbed a root and dragged myself toward the bank. I was about halfway there, in 4 feet of fast water, when I felt something solid beside me. An arm, thick as a young tree, steadying me, guiding me toward the shallows. I didn't look. I just held on and let it help me. When I got to the bank and finally looked up, the riverman was crouching beside me on the gravel, looking at my leg, with what I can only describe as concern. Not the nervous energy of an animal near something unfamiliar, the focused attention of someone assessing a problem. It touched my leg gently, fingers careful and precise as a doctor's, pressing along the bone. There was knowledge in that touch, the kind of knowledge that comes from having tended injuries. Before, it walked me back to camp. 300 yards of uneven ground, and it stayed beside me, every step, letting me lean on it. When I was on my cot, it stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then it was gone. I didn't drown in 4 feet of cold water on a Tuesday morning because something chose to help me. I've thought about that word, chose, many times since. In the summer of 1992, I was struggling with a particular run I'd fished for 3 years that had inexplicably gone dead. The riverman watched me work it for 2 evenings. On the third evening, it walked past me into the water upstream and stood still in the current for a long time. Then it pointed at the bank, not at the water, at the bank about 40 feet above the run, where a pair of birches had been logged, their stumps still raw. The shade those trees had provided was gone. The water temperature in that run had climbed enough to push the fish elsewhere. It was so obvious once I saw it, but the riverman wasn't done. It walked to those stumps and stood over them for a long time, with an expression I'd come to recognize. Not quite grief, not quite anger, but a compound of both, with something underneath I can only call incomprehension, as if after all its years of watching us, it still couldn't fully account for our choices. We destroy what sustains us, and then we spend our lives confused about why things stop working. That was the first lesson. In the summer of 1997, something happened that I still struggle to describe. I'd been at the camp 10 days and was packing up to drive back to Española when I heard the riverman behind me. I turned, and it was standing at the edge of the trees, with another one, smaller, younger, maybe 6 feet, with lighter fur, and eyes that held an alertness I recognized as youth, the particular quality of attention that hasn't learned yet what to filter out. The riverman made a long, complex series of sounds to the young one. Then it looked at me and did something simple and devastating. It gestured from the young one to me and then toward the river. "This is Roy. He's safe. This is our river." Before they left, the young one raised one hand, palm out, fingers spread. I raised mine back. Trust is the most difficult thing any creature can extend to another. When it is given across difference, across every reason not to, it is the most sacred thing in the world. That was the fourth lesson. My last summer at the camp was 1999. I was 69. My knee was giving out, and Darlene's sister had gotten sick down in Thunder Bay and needed someone nearby. I packed up in September and left the shed as I found it. But first, I went back to say goodbye to the river. I fished the deep pool where I'd first seen the riverman 10 years before. I stayed until dusk, the way I always had, working the old water, letting the current take my line, the way it had taken so many evenings of my life. It came. Of course it came. Walked out of the birches on the far bank, the way it had the very first time, and stood watching me from across the water. Older now, slower, the fur more gray than dark. We looked at each other across 40 feet of dark river in the last October light. Then the riverman crouched down and put both hands in the river, held them there in the current for a long moment. Then it stood, and with those wet hands, touched its own face, forehead, cheeks, the bridge of that broad nose, the way you might receive something, a blessing maybe. Then it pointed at me. I waded across to the far bank, the first and only time I ever stood on that side of the river with the riverman, and I put my own hands in the water and held them there. We stood like that for a while, two old creatures, hands in a cold river, in a forest that was smaller than it used to be, in the last light of a day that was ending. Then the riverman turned and walked into the shield forest, and I never saw it again. I'm 79 years old. I have 3 photographs. I have pages of field notes. I have a hand-tied fly in a wooden box on my nightstand. And I have this, the certain knowledge that for 10 years something ancient and intelligent chose to share its river with a broken old man who needed it. The biggest mystery is not whether these creatures exist. The biggest mystery is what they must think of us, watching from the tree line as we log and polluted us and rush past everything worth slowing down for, and still choosing, some of them, on some cold mornings, end quote, to step forward, end quote, to help, to teach, to place a hand on the shoulder of something that doesn't deserve it, and stay anyway. The river where we met still runs. I checked last spring. Still dark and cold and alive, even with the ridges above it scarred. Still catching light on the riffles, the way it always has. Be quiet in the old forests. Move slowly along the rivers. Leave things better than you found them, because something is watching, and it has been watching far longer than we have been looking.